This afternoon we're tackling how governments can govern better and rebuild capacity, and no better person to have than the Minister responsible for all of these things, Senator Katy Gallagher. No pressure. Who, if people don't know, simultaneously holds portfolio responsibility for finance, women and the public service, in addition to her role in the Senate more generally, and given the shape of the Senate, that's obviously a fairly demanding task too, I would imagine. Joining the Minister on the panel is Frances Maguire from the Chifley Research Centre Board, and Frances will be leading the conversation that we have after Katy has addressed us, and also dealing with some of the Q&As that obviously people have lodged. Next to Frances is Lynn Hatfield-Dodds, who I'm sure will be known to many people in the ACT for various roles. Lynn is now in the not-for-profit sector, but she has been in the public service and in a range of other roles, all of which have some relevance to just about every area of Katy's portfolios, I think. And the final panellist is also a board member of ours, and it's Amit Singh. And Amit is currently a consultant these days, and among the many areas that he works in, he's covering fields like digitisation in government and how to improve government service delivery, etc., etc. But Amit has had a distinguished career as a policy advisor and a strategic advisor in the corporate sector, in addition to working as a ministerial advisor and prime ministerial advisor. So a pretty strong panel today to join Minister Gallagher, and I'd just like to invite you, Katy, to address us first.
Thanks very much, David, and thanks everyone for coming out on a beautiful Canberra Sunday afternoon. I'd like to begin by paying respect to the ancient Ngunnawal people upon whose land we gather this afternoon, and I thank them for their ongoing custodianship and care of this beautiful country. And I extend all that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples joining us here today. And in that spirit of reconciliation and respect, I look forward to working together to implement the Uluru Statement from the Heart, including a constitutionally enshrined voice to our national parliament. Can I also acknowledge David Epstein, Executive Director of the Chifley Research Centre, and thank you for the invitation to speak today. I've got a posse of Senate colleagues up the back, Anne Urquhart, Linda White and Senator Fatima Payman. We're a small but mighty team, but they're here, so thank you very much for coming today, and of course to my fellow panellists. Today I've been invited to speak briefly on building capacity to govern and restoring public sector capability. I'm 7 months into my role as Minister for the Public Service, and I've learnt over that time the huge task that our government has to grapple with in rebuilding and repositioning the APS. But we're up for this important work. It's a huge job because of a decade of coalition governments saw a sustained assault on the public service, an assault that saw thousands of permanent jobs and capability lost. But it wasn't only the jobs and skills that we lost. The independence and integrity of the public service as an enduring institution was attacked and weakened. Some called Prime Minister Morrison's Prime Ministership as the command and control, minister know best model of public administration. Ministers who passed the buck, politicised processes, blamed departments for their own mistakes and removed those who stood up and disagreed, and created a culture of fear within the APS that meant frank and fearless advice was not sought or provided when it was needed most. Perhaps the most obvious and harmful example of this approach is robo-debt, a massive failure of public administration with catastrophic consequences. A scheme that we are learning shocking new details about every day through the Royal Commission hearings, with 3 ministers and 1 Prime Minister required to take the stand to explain their role about what they knew and what they did. Watching the public service on the stand with official after official that didn't want to deliver the bad news to ministers and that was focused on delivering for government rather than being the architects of legal and careful policy responses. Robo-debt might stand out in a league of its own as the combination of everything that was rotten with the previous government and its dealings with the APS. But the devaluing and debasing of the APS was also about the politicisation of public appointments, the pork barrelling, the sports rorts, car park rorts, despite repeated ANAO reports, the failures of integrity of ministers without consequence, the Morrison multiple ministry saga. How could that have happened in a traditional and professional government? It simply wouldn't have. So the cost of the failures of successive coalition governments to deal with the serious policy challenges of our time, something that the APS should lead on, and to not allow the public service to do their job as the apolitical strategic policy arm with deep knowledge and expertise, will be felt for years to come. As Minister for Finance, I see the cost of these failures every day as I wade through the work needed in health, in Medicare, in aged care, in energy and climate, in First Nations services, in housing, in arts, in the environment, in overseas assistance, in the area of data and digital. And these are just a few which spring to mind, which either exist in either a state of crisis like aged care and energy, or systems heaving under pressure in desperate need of new policy responses and reform. Never again can we allow the Liberals to try and get away with their rubbish of being superior budget managers, because it is total and utter rubbish. In reality, this mob in government were budget vandals. They ignored the big challenges, knowing they wouldn't go away, but happy to leave them to another government to deal with, despite the cost of delay. They loaded the budget up with billions in political payoffs to their junior partner. They left billions in harsh and unfair zombie measures to dress up their budget bottom line, knowing that those measures would never get through the Senate. They riddled the budget with terminating programs, billions in ongoing spending never accounted for, like the adult dental program, for example. Does that sound like a terminating program? This negligent approach not only comes at a huge cost to the budget, but importantly a huge cost to the people who rely on the services from government. And whilst it wasn't only budget decisions that eroded the capability of the APS to do the jobs Australians needed them to do, although slashing the public service did feature prominently over the past 10 years, it was also the lack of commitment or belief in the important ongoing role that the APS plays, that goes beyond individual governments and parliamentary terms. Remember when Mr Morrison addressed the hard-working men and women of the APS in 2019, saying that they do not set policy and that they must serve quiet Australians and look beyond the noisy Canberra bubble. This statement turned out to be ironic, because we know now it was not the APS operating within a Canberra bubble, but the government itself. But it was a clear message from the top, as was installing a political appointment to the head of PM&C. This stuff matters. It's about culture that this approach fosters. Under the Coalition's watch, the private sector took hold of jobs that should have been done in-house, and they did so by billing by the hour. Critical functions outsourced to the private sector, with some areas of government losing all policy capability during this time. And yet, despite this, the public service continued on to trying to provide essential services to the Australian people through natural disasters, pandemics and the rest. And this is an enormous credit to the APS employees who delivered these despite such challenging circumstances. Some of you will know the work we have underway to undo some of the damage that has been done to strengthen and rebuild capability, independence and integrity into the APS. But this is going to take some time. 10 years of neglect isn't going to be undone overnight. The work of renewal began as soon as we were elected last year with the PM's announcement of the APS reform agenda, and he gave me responsibility for this work. I'll quickly take you through a few of the elements of this broad reform agenda, but there's basically 4 priority areas: an APS that embodies integrity in everything it does, an APS that puts people and business at the centre of policy and services, an APS that is a model employer, and an APS that has the capability to do its job well. There will be legislative reform to entrench critical changes in the APS. We will create a purpose statement to help build a strong understanding of the APS's role. This is important because the APS is more than a broad institution. It needs to have a strong identity. It will also importantly mean that if a future government wishes to unwind these laws, It will require a deliberate decision of government to do so and the support of the Parliament to proceed. No more whittling and eroding away quietly over multiple terms in office. We're also reviewing the role of the Public Service Commission and the Public Service Commissioner through the first organisational capability review. We will have capability reviews being enshrined in legislation. We'll add stewardship as a new APS value, and we'll extend APS values to all PGPA Act agencies. I can tell you what that means through the questions if you like. Conducting an audit of employment is underway to inform our commitment to reducing the APS's reliance and spend on the external workforce. We'll deliver long-term insight briefings and publish a survey of trust in Australian public services, and also publish APS census data and the action plans to run alongside them. We're going to boost First Nations employment, implement SES behaviour and outcomes-based performance management, and support the APS Net Zero by 2030 commitment. The audit of employment is important because that will ensure that we know exactly what our workforce looks like, and we'll also pilot an in-house consulting model. And importantly, with my colleague Dr. Andrew Lee and the Treasurer, embed a culture of evaluation across the APS. I'll touch briefly on another hat, which is the gender equality work that I'm doing, but this is also aligned with the APS reform agenda. We're bringing a gender equality lens to everything we do across government, whether it be through the budget process or through whole of government policy making. This is really important work on its own and probably warrants a speech by itself, but I'll have more to say on that in the lead up to International Women's Day. In terms of public sector appointments, you may have seen in the press today we've announced a review of the public sector board appointment process. This is really to end the culture of jobs for mates. We want to change the appointments, really important appointments across the APS, often well paid as well, that ensure that people actually get appointed for what they know, not who they know, which is a bit of a change from the last 10 years. We're very fortunate that Ms Linnell Briggs, who you may know from Canberra circles and APS circles, but also formerly, I think her last big job was as a Royal Commissioner for the Aged Care Royal Commission. She brings a whole stack of expertise, obviously, to this job, and we look forward to working with her and seeing what her recommendations are. Now, I'll just briefly finish because I was only meant to talk for 10 minutes, but I'm a senator and we get paid by how long we talk, so I've probably exceeded that. But I just wanted to mention data and digital because this falls under my hat as well, and obviously this is a huge part of the public service of the future. Getting the data and digital response right is going to be key to us getting the public service and the APS in shape to be a modern public service delivering for Australians, working with states and territories and the private sector as we're in the middle or on the cusp of a huge transformation. We're not quite there yet and there's a lot of work to do, but that also forms a really important part of the work that I'm going to do. I might leave it there. I should finish by saying there is a lot of talent in the public service. We want to attract more talent. There is a lot of capability. It hasn't been well led, and I think that was a deliberate decision of the former government. We want to strengthen it. We want to support the APS to fulfil its role, and importantly, we want to ensure that it's an enduring institution which is central to the success of our democracy. So thank you very much for the opportunity to talk today.
Thank you, Katy. I'm sure everyone was really interested in what you had to say, and certainly you covered the ground of a very complex and large, let's say, reform challenge really thoroughly. Thank you. I'm going to ask now for some of the two members on the panel to share their thoughts in response to what you've just said and outlined, and I'm sure that will also be of interest to you lot out there, right?
Mine was on. tricky tech people, some on, some off. I'm delighted to be here, and like Katy, I pay my deep respects to the First Nations owners of the country that we're meeting on today, and the countries that everybody here comes from, always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And I'm delighted we have a government that wants to govern and is responding to the Uluru Statement from the heart, a key priority. The PM's speech today was great. But we're here to talk about the capability of the public service and how that can help governments drive their agendas. So I want to start off. I mean, it's a really obvious thing to say, but it's worth saying, I think, that public sector capability is absolutely critical to the Commonwealth Government's ability to deliver on its agenda, whoever is governing. And I think I wanted to make some remarks in the domain of key capabilities and then how you might bake those into the system. So the key capabilities, in my mind, fall into three key domains: collaboration, cooperation and culture. And you spoke about each of those, actually, Minister. So I think the first thing I want to start off by saying is we live in a VUCA world, a world that is volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous. I'm in my 50s, and people in their 40s, go us. Go us, Francis. But, my kids are about 25 and about 30, and they talk about old people being 35 and over. So my oldest is living in San Francisco now, in Silicon Valley, working in an AI startup, loving life over there, but has been over Christmas, and it was quite depressing. Every conversation, it's like, well, Mum, you would never understand that. You're so old. I was like, oh my God. But the point is, there is sadly some truth in that, where I grew up in a world of certainty, and most of us in our 50s, 60s, possibly even into our 40s, grew up in a world that was much more certain than the world we live in now. And so leadership is more and more characterised by the ability to make good judgments and by the ability, a lot of the stuff the PM said about thinking about the referendum of the voice, I think is true about any form of leadership. Really good, solid leadership is around having a view about the purpose and the objects of whatever you are leading, and then being able to inspire, equip, and strategise with others, to bring people along on that journey. And so I think that goes to the collaboration and cooperation and working in an ambiguous and uncertain environment. In terms of public policy, in this country, we've been fortunate enough to solve a lot of our big problems. And again, over the course of the last 2 days, we've talked about that. We've got a Medicare system. We've got a really good public education system. We've gone after some of those things that have really set us up to be a thriving nation and to leave as few people behind as we can. We're not perfect at all, but we do pretty well, I think. In a really complex environment, the only certainty we have is that we need to collaborate and cooperate with each other across industry lines, across sectors, in order to actually deliver real-world outcomes that are going to make an enduring difference. So you can no longer sit in the Commonwealth, if you're an APS public servant, and really think in your heart of hearts and say to your colleagues most of the time, state's a bit crap, aren't they? We are a much better quality public service in the States. Now, people don't say quite that thing, but it's kind of that's a bit of the sense that, so there's a bit of a culture, and the States do the same. They're sitting around going, we know about operations, and the Commonwealth is just sitting in Canberra making up policy. In actual fact, the Federation works best when it works together, and where different levels of government, including local government, bring the capabilities and expertise and insights and understanding they have from the domain of governance in which they operate to solve for complexity. So if what's left is complex and if what's required is collaboration, it's really important that the public service and the APS for the Commonwealth takes that seriously. And I guess, one of the current examples I was thinking about this morning is just there's a lot of fabulous reform agendas running right now, and I could think of 6 off the top of my head this morning that I'm involved in one way or another, talking to people, inputting in, that are clustered around sort of humans, productivity and the state of our economy. And so they are, just running through them really quickly, the Treasury Employment White Paper process, the Health Review led by Robin Cruck, the Economic Inclusion Advisory Council led by Jenny Macklin. I really hope I've got that name right, or she will let me know. The Women's Employment and Equality Task Force led by Sam Mostyn, the Migration Review led by Martin Parkinson, and the care economy work that PM&C are leading. So those things at first glance, you know, what does the care economy have to do with the Health Review and so on? But they are interrelated, and harmonising that work is really critical. And so one of the things, I think one of the challenges, Minister, that you'll have and Gordon de Brauw will have is working out how to bake the requirement for harmonisation into the APS. It has to be a core competency of leadership into the future. So for example, I work in the NGO sector in human services. My organisation delivers allied health NDIS services across 3 states. What we need is migration reform that's going to deliver us absolutely more workforce. Like everybody knows, that's our limiting factor. But interestingly, what we need is, unlike, you know, usually in our migration reform settings, we go for younger professionals are better than older professionals because they can work for longer in Australia before we have to support their retirement. Actually, what we need right now in some of our health services, so for me in allied health, I need us to import mid to late career allied health professionals to support young Australian physios, OTs, speechies and whatever. So I can employ one of those mid to late experts for 10 to 12 to 15 junior Australian domestically trained people. We probably need to do this for 5 to 10 years till we rebalance. And then I can have a bigger workforce that can go after the really long waiting lines we've got right across the country for many NDIS supports. And I see a lot of you nodding. Some of you will have family members and people you know in that position. So that's important, right? But that links into, that migration work links into, so Robin Cruck's recommendations that she's going to make. They both need to factor in the work that Treasury is doing about workforce and the constraints we've got on building our workforce. All of those things need to speak to the work that Jenny and Sam are doing, again in my space in the care economy, fastest growing part of the Australian economy, totally female dominated, very low skill, very underpaid and under-resourced. So what are we going to do about all of that? Because it's not just about productivity, participation or the economy, it's got to be about a purpose for that we want people, you know, in Amartya Sen's words, to be able to live their best lives. So that's super important. A little story about cooperation. When I worked in the APS, I worked in the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, and I had responsibility for COAG. Although, as Andrew Barr once said to me when I said that to him, I think you'll find Lynn First Ministers have responsibility for COAG. It's like, that's true. But so I was organising the secretariat for COAG. But in my time there, I was the first APS leader to ever take a team out to the states and territories to discuss shared jurisdictional concerns. So I'd take my team out once or twice a year and we would meet with every state and territory jurisdiction. The first time we went out, we just met with First Minister's departments and they were waiting for the shoe to drop for us to spring something on them. So this goes to integrity, to transparency, to communication, to bringing people along with the things that the PM said in his speech this morning. We spent 3 years doing that and then we had to get up a hospital's heads of agreement. And what nobody told me is they generally take 2 or 3 years from when Cabinet says, yep, go for it, to when you land the agreement. Because I had no idea that was the case, we did it in 3 weeks. Now that wasn't because why, but we'd built relationships of deep trust with really significant decision-making capability parts of state and territory public services. That was one thing that we did differently. The next thing we did differently, when you're a deputy at PM&C, you have an office that's about a third of the size of this room. They're quite large offices. So I had everybody who had any knowledge of a hospital's heads agreement in my office for the 18 hours a day we were working for that 3 weeks. One of the guys, an ASO4, just held all the stuff. So the guy who was working most closely with him, we'd come up with these ideas and Josh would sit in the corner and go, not legal, or you can't do that, or that won't work, or people tried it in 1980, whatever, and it didn't work. So we had really fast feedback loops, and then finally we made it fun. I'm a big believer in fun when you're trying to do hard, heavy, sustained lifting. And that meant we could do it. So there's lots of elements. A reform agenda isn't just about having a strategy. It's actually equipping and enabling leaders to do things differently. And I have to shout out to Dr. Martin Parkinson, who was the Secretary of the Treasury at the time of PM&C, who gave me enormous licence to bring the diversity of how I operated as a leader into the APS and disrupt the system in what I hope was a positive way. The final thing I want to say is it is important to bake things in, and so it's really terrific to hear the Minister talking about legislation. And I've been talking with Dr. Gordon de Brouwer, who's the Secretary for Public Service Reform, and I checked with him today, and it's okay for me to say this, I checked with the Minister, but there's a lot of work going on about what do you bake into the Public Service Act. So what do you actually require legislatively of public service leadership in the APS? And I think that's a really brilliant move, because we're no longer reliant on having some good leaders who are somehow magically formed in the system. We're requiring the system to itself think structurally about how do we grow and develop leaders who exhibit the right leadership capabilities and skills that are required for the future, not for the past. The APS leading forward has to have leadership that can lead for the next 20, 30, 50 years, not looking back to what worked in the 50s, 60s, 70s and 80s.
Thanks, Lynn, and I think that would be a resounding support for the Minister's plans and actions to date. And I think too that sort of, again, this theme that seems to have come up over the last couple of days, Minister, around the government's sort of courage, let's say, in lots of ways, to saying, okay, this is going to be legislated, you know, we need this to actually sort of like be seen as important and remain important for as long as possible. And it's going to be a big effort to unwind what we're trying to put into place. So I think there's a resounding support around for taking those sort of measures. And now I think before the Minister has the opportunity to sort of add to that in terms of, you know, just the gap between where we are now in the public service, who have tried very hard, in my experience, and worked very hard, usually often doing 3 or 4 jobs for many years, and having risen to the occasion in COVID. I mean, amazing what they were able to achieve and the commitment they showed, and how they're going to be supported in the transition from where they are now to where they're going. I'd like to hear from the Minister on that. But Amit, your thoughts on where we are with capability and what you think's a priority or important given the future we're all facing into, with all its joy of massive change that we're in the middle of, and which seems to be continuing apace. Aren't we lucky? I think we are, actually, but you know.
Thanks, everyone. Like the Minister, like Lynn and like Francis, I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which we meet, and pay respects to the elders past, present and emerging. I want to sort of start by just acknowledging everybody else in the room. I've been a director of the Chifley Research Centre for a long time, as David Epstein pointed out. But I think what I want to say is that I have the deepest respect for everybody else's contribution to the policy debate in this country, and the policy debate at, you know, in hard times. At the moment, the sun is shining on us, and it's nice, but it's also just to acknowledge everybody else's contributions to that, so thank you for that. I'm going to focus my comments really largely on the data and digital question and how we should think about what happens there. I'm really going to just break down my comments into three broad buckets. I mean, why should we care? Why should we care as progressives? What can we do about it? Like, what's possible to be done? And why should we be excited? And I think that's actually quite important to remember that. There's no more important task than rebuilding and renewing the Australian public service. Like, that is the centre of, if all of us, if all of us could basically get one wish on policy making in this country, that would be my one wish, right? Now, in order to do that, we need to improve, what that will do is improve our ability to deliver for Australians, which will then enable us to build more trust with Australians, which is important to preserving our democracy, and that's what the Prime Minister spoke about this morning. But you can't deliver in 2023 if you don't have a digital way to deliver. More Australians interact with the Australian government every single day than use public transport across the entire country, right? Yet the way in which we actually deal with that is pretty sclerotic and not particularly great. So the first thing I want to start with is, why should we be excited? And so I say this, and means with all the amount of sincerity that comes with it, right? The single most exciting part about government service delivery or digital service delivery in the federal government is the person sitting to the right of me. And the reason why that is the most exciting part is because for the first time, we're joining together different aspects of the government to effectively provide a mechanism for actually taking digital service delivery seriously. Under the previous governments we saw digital service delivery as some little thing on the side. We treated it as a service, as a program, as an app. We didn't think of it as a platform, right? And the truth is, digital service delivery and the things that underpin digital service delivery are critical national infrastructure. And to be able to do that properly, it has to be at the centre of government. It has to be where a central agency or where a minister that's dealing with it can deal with it. But it also has to be connected with the Australian Public Service, right? And in the past, we've disconnected those things. We've left them out in the wilderness. And part of the reason we've left them out in the wilderness is because we've treated technology as if it's something that can be done by a bunch of fandangled people that live in Silicon Valley or somewhere else. Public sector government digital delivery is a completely different concept. You're not treating for like the median. You're not doing pilots, that are testing out different things. Your use cases are actually everybody. The underlying fundamental principle is that no one gets left behind. That's not the case when you're delivering technology services in a whole range of other places. And so I think that's kind of really important to underscore that, because if you don't build in those values to the way in which you think about government service delivery, digital government service delivery, then you end up with situations like robo-debt. Then you end up with situations where citizens are not put at the centre of it. So I think that would be one thing about why we should be excited. I think government digital service delivery the principles that underpin it are not new. That's the other aspect of this. There is innovation, but innovations are in the tools, not in the principles or the purposes that underpin them. They still have to resort to the same trust rules and the trust metrics that we expect from typical government service delivery, from the typical work of the Australian Public Service. Trust is a function of competence and character. Trust is a function of capability and reliability. Doing something well, doing it all the time. Trust is a function of character. Doing it with integrity, doing it for the benefit of other people, right? Those rules still apply when you think about government digital service delivery. Because ultimately what we're really trying to do is the big why. What we're really trying to do is deliver better, enhance the trust that people have in government, and deliver for the national economy. Now, there was a very conservative estimate, and I say this as an economist, there was a very conservative estimate that the benefits of fixing MyGov, for example, which is only one aspect of government digital delivery, would deliver over $3 billion for the national economy. I think it's incredibly conservative, right? I honestly think the benefit of not being able to get those damn emails that say you've got mail and not tell you what it's about is is enough. But I think that's really important. The other thing I think that we need to do so why should we care as progressives is I think that a lot of times we get lost in the debate about the complexity of technology, and that, and that becomes the thing that becomes the mental block for us to actually think about government digital service delivery, right? We get worried about what's the role that AI plays, and here's a new thing. All of those are distractions. These are fundamentally policy problems. These are not technology problems. And in fact, if you ask anybody that's experienced in delivering a technology issue, the problems where technology is the problems where when you're delivering a digital service, whether it's in the private sector and the public sector, and where the technology has been insufficient, is actually 1/10 of the total problems, right? If someone did a survey of this a while back, and they worked out that actually the problem isn't that the technology doesn't exist. The technology definitely exists. The problem is that we didn't set the right expectations. The problem is that we didn't have the right governance. The problem is that we didn't do the right measurement. The problem is that we didn't have the right capability of the people using them. It's not that the technology isn't a problem. One of my favorite quotes, or one of my favorite sort of things that people use is there's a professor, Melvin Kranzberg, who has these different rules of technology. And the first law, Kranzberg's first law, is technology is neither good nor bad nor neutral. And I think And I think the point is we get really hung up on the fact that it's actually a technology problem. It's not. It's a policy problem, and that policy problem is why I'm excited about the role that Katy's already flagged, and I think the things that are going to come in coming years is because it's fundamentally a governance issue, right? We've always left and segregated the way in which we think about government digital service delivery, and there's an opportunity to correct that. I mean, there's an opportunity to think about that slightly differently, because the government thinks in silos, right? And humans and and citizens, when we use government services, don't think about that. We don't really know which department does this and which department does that. And the incredible thing is that the Australian Public Service, has delivered for people. When there were the floods in northern New South Wales, those payments arrived instantly, right? And the reason they arrived so quickly was because the 3 departments that worked on this worked out how to deal with it, and they had a platform to deliver it for people. Now imagine if we could do that on every issue. Imagine if we could expand the scale of that. Imagine if your child was born, you didn't have to navigate between how am I going to get, how am I going to register for childcare, and how am I going to get this, and how am I going to get that. Those services were integrated and brought to you. And the last point I want to finish on is why should we care about it as progressives, right? Because if we do technology in a completely value-agnostic world, then we will not use it to deliver better for individuals and citizens. Right? The values that should underpin the way in which we think about government digital delivery should be the same values that we use in anything else. No one should get left behind. There shouldn't be a postcode lottery. Today, there is currently a postcode lottery in government digital delivery. If you live in Sydney, your experience of government is infinitely better than if you live in Melbourne. Right, and I say that as a Melbourneite, right? Like that issue should not be. We need to work to correct those things. We need to make sure that as Australians we get better digital delivery. Now that's not the responsibility of the federal government, but the federal government has a role to play as an orchestrator. The federal government can play a role in doing better, in supporting some of the states and supporting some of the other agencies around the country coming up to speed. But the point isn't that. The point is more about our values as progressives and our values inbuilt into the way in which we think about it. And the last point I'll make is, and all of those, the consequence of all of those is trustworthiness, right? We need to build a system that gives people trust that government can deliver for them. And, as I said, everybody in their pockets has some version of ways in which they can access the federal government and interact with it all the time. Hopefully it won't now be, you've got mail and no reason why, you know what I mean? But there are other ways in which we can deliver better, and the more we look like we're delivering better, the more people have trust in government. The more people have trust in government, the more they can have faith in public institutions. The more they have faith in public institutions, the more it strengthens their resolve to join, be part of, and support those institutions, and it builds their overall capability. So it is a virtuous circle in the way we think about it.
Thank you, Amit. Again, I hear the themes, Minister, of the human in the technology revolution, and how important the public service is in that, in carrying the values that we want the technology to sort of embody, let's say. And also, again, collaboration, the theme that was very strong in what Lynn had to say about what's important in getting outcomes and allowing or supporting the various public services to work together in a way that's much more effective. So I'm wondering, Minister, your response to how do you? It's a big call. How do you support people or allow people or bring people along on that journey? And given you've got a lot to do, and woefully, I think the electoral terms here are way too short. But that's just my personal view. To get stuff. It wouldn't it though? And so I'm just wondering the transition plan, or for you, what's your priorities to get done in the here and now and allow the transition to happen? And still, you've still got to produce all these results, don't you? You poor thing.
Is this one on?
Yeah.
Yep.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks. That's good. I need that. There is, So I think the challenge with all of this is making sure we're aligning all of the pieces of work. So it's it's following a path that people can understand, and I mean that for people working in the public service as well. So they don't see, these different bits happening across different parts of government, but no one drawing it all together into an actual narrative about what we're trying to achieve. So the public sector reform has a very
big role in that, in articulating what we're doing, in working with secretaries, in getting information out to the public service about what's happening, how it's happening, in reporting back. Part of the transparency and publication of information like the census and the trust survey are important, about being honest about areas we're not doing so well, and sort of embedding all of that so people can see we're serious, that it's just not a folly that we're doing because we want to beat up the people who were here last, but something that we believe in deeply and want to get right. I also think expectation management is important. You know, we've got a big and ambitious agenda, you know, and we'll get as much done as we can in the next couple of years, but it's a much longer piece of work. So some of the first things we need to settle are the things that are going to ensure that it's an enduring piece of work. So that matters. On the data and digital, you know, I completely agree with everything it said. It's, you know, I don't think we can even imagine what it's going to be like by the time we finish, and probably ever finish, the transformation that's happening in a digital service delivery sense. But the opportunities to make it easier and better for citizens to engage with government, seamless, whether it be state governments or the Commonwealth, is there. We've just got to work out how to get there and not stuff it up on the way so that no one believes we can do it, which goes back to trust and reliability and capability and control. But yeah, I think pulling all of this together and setting it out, which we're trying to do through different pieces of work, but joining it all up and being honest about, you know, the time it's going to take to get there, and some of the hard work I think that's going to have to be done in order to achieve it.
Thank you for that. I was just thinking when you were speaking, Minister, about the danger of being pushed to go too quickly. I remember, as a lot of you in this room would remember, the first rollout of the NDIS and the portal crashing, and I led the team that was asked to review that. And sort of essentially, not wanting to divulge anything confidential, but essentially it was that there wasn't enough testing, there wasn't enough user testing, all the standard things. They're really standard things to do when you're doing large technology transformation, because there were sort of deadlines. So I think the fact that you're obviously well aware of the time involved and are willing to sort of be public about that and not be pushed by, I think, a 24/7 news cycle type situations, you know, and an uninformed sort of constituency, you know. I don't think enough information was given to the people expecting the services. So that really gives me a lot of heart. But again, also that the Public Service Reform Commission being able to being in existence and being able to bring that all together and to align the narrative with the values of the new government. So it's really clear that, yes, this is all going together. I mean, it's very much linked, I think, in some way to the voice and the approach there. In some ways, that's sort of setting, it's good that it's sort of setting the lead way, isn't it, really? The government's sort of determination, I think, as well as openness, you know. So I think we're probably right on time, aren't we? Amazing. There have been a couple of questions, which a couple of them weren't actually about this session, and one other which I might just, I thought it was really lovely. I might just ask the Minister. This is from someone, Lucy, you're here somewhere, I know. This is someone that's really, possibly. It's a real person, and I don't think Lucy's from Point Palper. I think she's from Victoria, actually. But anyway, oh, there she is. And Lucy, you might like to ask the Minister your question yourself. I thought it was a great question.
What would you consider mandatory reading? Do you want me to say it again? Yeah. Take two. For someone that wants to participate in the conversation around the ideas of the future of economics and finance or the public service, what would you consider mandatory reading?
I can see Daniel Molino over there in the audience. I'm working my way through.
There's lots of authors.
I'm reading Daniel's book at the moment, which is really interesting, around social services and the history and, you know, opportunities there. I would say read broadly and widely. Read the AFR. I think you have to, because everyone talks about that in the circles. You need to do that. So yeah, all of those. I would read newspapers. I would read, you know, I think read books and ideas that don't always align with your own thinking. Like for me, I read The Deficit Myth, which a lot of people no doubt will have read. And there's good bits in that and there's bits I don't agree with. But I think the beauty about reading and reading widely and reading outside of, say, a traditional finance area, because like for finance, you've got to know a bit about everything. You've got to understand health, you've got to understand education, you've got to understand states and territories, you've got to understand revenue, you know, because your job is sort of to coordinate and pull everything together and work out how you're going to fund new things in that area and which probably don't need as much funding at the moment. I mean, that's the job of the finance minister in a sense. And so learning about all parts of the economy and how it all comes together, I think is really important. So don't just read the policy wonks, you know, or the economists, although they are very smart and know not a lot, but read really widely about, you know, government and why we do the things we do, and then read something for fun as well.
Thank you very much, Katy. And you couldn't get better advice from a better mentor than Katy Gallagher. So we express our appreciation for you spending your time here. So much to do.